Well, welcome everyone to our session today. You will see that there is a poll question up in front of you. So if you have a few minutes of your time at the beginning of our session here as people are logging on, please feel free to complete the poll. So I see we have a lot of people joining us today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us during this Ask an Expert session. Our session today is focused on how to implement a victim-centered trauma-informed program for survivors of human trafficking. This session is recording, so you will receive a copy or a video, a link to the recording after today's session today, along with a few other materials that we have prepared. So our format today is a moderated session. We have our moderator, and then we have a panel of experts that are going to be answering your questions that you have. And the way that we'll do that is throughout the session today, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, then you will be able to type in a question, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can today. For those that we aren't able to answer during the live session, we will send out an FAQ document at the end of the session today. There is also closed captioning feature. So if you would like to enable that, that is a feature down at the bottom of your screen as well. You can click on that and enable closed captioning. So we are going to turn it over now to Bill Wolfe from the Office of Victims, or Office for Victims of Crime, and he will provide some opening remarks. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks, Lauren, and good afternoon, everyone. It is really exciting to see so many participants joining for this really important panel. So thankful for all of the work that you all are doing in the field, and just know on behalf of the Director of the Office for Victims of Crime and the entire human trafficking team at OVC, we stand ready to support you all in the work that you're doing. Many of you may or may not be too familiar with OVC. We are a component of the Department of Justice. We are predominantly a grant-making component, but we are so fortunate that at OVC we have so many incredible experts from the field that have experiences, and in particular within the human trafficking space as well. Recently, under the leadership of Director Hart, OVC went through a reorganization, and as part of that reorganization, we created a standalone human trafficking division so that we can really focus our expertise on this particular issue. And there's so many incredible team members there. Kristen Weschler is our resident expert on housing issues, and I think she'll be joining you all today. So very, very fortunate to work alongside these folks. My background is in law enforcement. I came from working these cases, but much like many of you, when I first encountered the issue of human trafficking, I really didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how it really impacted the world. And as a police officer, we started going out and investigating the cases, but one of the biggest gaps or deficiencies that we had was a victim service provider. A group that we could refer the victims that we identified over to be able to receive appropriate services, case management, housing, life skills, all of those things. And it was a really frustrating time for us. And I was very fortunate to come alongside a group that had just sort of formed, and they reached out and they said, what can we do to help you? And I said, we really need somebody to help with the victims, to help support them, to empower them on that road to recovery. And very, very fortunate that they took up the charge. But one of the things that we realized very early on is there were not a lot of resources for new organizations that were getting into this space. There were not a lot of resources for existing organizations. And as time evolved, I was very fortunate to come on board here at the Office for Victims of Crime and be able to be a part of and witness this incredible project, this incredible capacity building center that has been established to fill that very specific gap that I highlighted, and that is to help you all in the field build the capacity, whether that is creating networks, figuring out best practices, getting access to federal funding, whatever it is, to be able to better support the victims that you serve. We know that human trafficking victims experience an immense amount of trauma, polyvictimization, and they are some of the most complex cases that law enforcement and victim service providers alike will ever encounter. And I'm so thankful for the incredible work that the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center is doing in conjunction with the incredible human trafficking team at the Office for Victims of Crime. So I really am thankful that you all have this opportunity to do this expert Q&A today. Please don't give them any softballs, hit them with the hard questions. Try to stump them, and I know that you're going to find that this panel of experts really can't be stumped. They know where to get these resources, where to get the answers to these questions. And again, on behalf of the Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, I want to thank you for your dedication, your service in supporting these victims. They need you, and I want you to know how much we recognize that you are such an integral and vital part to that process for them. So thank you again. I hope that you find today informative, and if there's anything that we can do for you all at OVC, please do not hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Susan Williams. Susan is a nationally recognized victim services expert and member of the Field Advisory Committee for the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center. So Susan, over to you.
All right, thank you, Bill. It is such a pleasure to be here today and really to be a part of the launch of the Ask an Expert series. Today, we are going to be talking about victim-centered and trauma-informed care and how it relates to the delivery of services for victims of human trafficking. We will explore strategies for providing holistic services that are offered through a trauma lens and share ideas for creating a victim-centered, trauma-informed organizational culture. Finally, we are going to provide guidance on how to navigate the myriad of resources that are available to support all of you in the work that you're doing. So let's get started. Joining me today are our three panelists, Kate Keisel, Christy Cho, and Marissa Castellanos. Kate is the CEO of the Sonar Institute, a transformational healing service for survivors of gender-based violence, and she is also part of Project Trust, an OVC training and technical assistance provider for trauma-informed care for survivors of human trafficking. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's such a pleasure to be here this afternoon.
And it's so great to have you. Christy is a human trafficking subject matter expert specializing in trauma-informed care and survivor-centered service programs. Christy is also a former visiting fellow with OVC, where she focused on researching and promoting survivor-informed services. Welcome, Christy.
Thanks, Susan. Hello, everyone.
And Marissa is the program director for the Bakita Empowerment Initiative, a program supporting and empowering survivors of human trafficking through Catholic Charities of Louisville. Welcome.
I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, I want to again thank Marissa, Christy, and Kate for being here today. And to get us started with the conversation, I'd like to ask our panelists a few questions. And Marissa, let's start with you. As someone who works directly with victims of human trafficking, how do you think trauma impacts them?
I think responses to trauma vary for every person, and they can really affect any aspect of life, such as relationships, self-esteem, emotional well-being, goal setting and follow-through, or engagement in services, also mental and physical health. And really, trauma impacts the whole person in a variety of ways that may increase or decrease in a moment, and could be triggered by something as simple maybe as a smell or a noise.
Thank you. And Kate, do you have anything to add?
I would just love to echo everything that was just shared. And, you know, at Senad, we really think about complex trauma and individuals that have experienced human trafficking. It's often one form of violence, one form of trauma that they've experienced throughout their life course. And very often, individuals that we work with would not necessarily identify that as the most traumatic event that they've had to overcome. So we really think about looking at that whole spectrum and then how trauma responses impact individuals' lives, right? Because when we think of trauma, we reflect back on the event, but trauma is really how it impacts us in the present moment. So when each of us are experiencing trauma responses in whatever way that looks like, we really think about how can we equip every single person that we're working with the tools and skills to manage those trauma responses and ensure that we all have access to avenues, paths, and individual infrastructures that will help us in our healing journey.
Thanks so much for that. Now I want to turn to Christy. Christy, can you talk a little bit about what it means for an organization to be victim-centered and trauma-informed?
Sure. Trauma-informed care realizes the prevalence of trauma. It recognizes how trauma affects all individuals involved and responds appropriately. Being victim-centered, trauma-informed organizations begins with understanding the physical, social, and emotional trauma on the individual, but it doesn't end there. That last point about responding appropriately should also include the fact that trauma-informed care should be extended to staff, especially since so much of the work done by direct service professionals is so relational. Any one of your staff members could be a survivor of interpersonal violence or abuse, various forms of community and structural violence, such as racism, homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia. Survivors also often bring to their work firsthand knowledge of abuse dynamics, resources, and coping strategies. They often have great empathy, passion, and commitment. At the same time, survivors can be more vulnerable to vicarious trauma, and trauma histories may negatively affect staff members' work at times. The OVC model standards is a great starting point for anybody who's curious about this. It provides guidelines and suggestions for organizations trying to build internal resources for this in order to help service practitioners and program administrators improve the quality and consistency of the response to crime victims.
Great. Thank you, Christy. And Kate, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first, I just want to echo everything that Christy shared. I'm so incredibly passionate about how we think about trauma consciousness in this field, how we move away from buzzwords that really serve their purpose, like trauma informed, and think about what it really means. So for us at Senar, we spend a lot of time working with organizations as someone with my own lived experience with moving forward from trauma in different ways and having a team that is very trauma informed, trauma focused, and lived experience oriented. We realize that we never are going to know when someone in the room is impacted by trauma. And as Christy mentioned, we never know when we're in the room with someone who identifies as a survivor and how they identify, how we identify with our own lived experience. So there really is this avenue of thinking about what does it mean to be person-centered in every single thing that we do as organizations. And what that also allows us to do is ensure that every interaction, whether it's with our colleagues, whether it's with a client that we're working with, whether it's with another entity in which we're engaging, that we're moving beyond the idea of just creating certain policies and protocols under the realm of being victim-centered, but moving it towards it is an engagement policy that happens at all levels of the organization. And so we really conceptualize this in 4 different categories. I always like concrete takeaways, right? We have these big abstract points of what does that mean, but how do we actually implement that? And so the first way that we look at that is having an understanding of how trauma impacts the brain, how it impacts every human and every individual, and that substantive trauma literacy that we bring to trauma consciousness. knowing that trauma is a nearly universal human experience. We normalize those responses and we build tools. We also ensure that we're empowerment based, right? We look at what individuals want, what their goals are, and how they seek to get to their end goals. We don't define them for other people, and we don't assume that we know. We recognize the impact of culture, and we take time to understand the relevance for each individual person that we work with, and we honor ethics. Ethics can be one of those moments where it's really, really dry and we think about ethical standards, but informed consent and boundaries and understanding dual relationships help us to achieve all of these goals. So we really look at those big picture pieces of how we accomplish this.
So, so important. Before we go on to the next question, I just want to remind listeners, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them on the question and answer box within this format. So, but thank you, Kate, and thank you, Christy. And so thinking about all of this, I guess my next question is what are the best ways for providing training for staff on this approach and on these practices? Marissa, let's start with you.
So staff should be trained on using a trauma-informed approach and on being victim-centered in a comprehensive way. So that should really include making sure you're addressing different aspects of programming, from crisis response, screening, intake, to meetings and communications with program participants, collaboration with community partners, the environment in which you're doing the work. It really needs to be comprehensive how we address it. And that starts with the training. It should also be training that is delivered through a variety of means. So that could include making sure staff have access to resources such as guides and research, white papers, presentations, webinars, to talk through these concrete aspects of being trauma-informed and survivor-centered. And then also making sure you're including a variety of topics. So maybe the topic is, it intersects. There are so many issues that intersect with being trauma-informed and survivor-centered. So for example, a training that's specifically on grounding techniques. That can be a really important skill in making sure that direct service providers have what they need when someone is experiencing some response to trauma in a specific moment, knowing how to work with them through grounding techniques. Also making sure that staff are involved in these discussions, because if we're talking about being trauma-informed with our staff, then we can hear back from them about where they see gaps or what their needs are in regards to their work with program participants, but also in regards to their own needs, which Christy mentioned. And there should be training that's specific for supervisors and agency leadership that really talks about the impact of vicarious trauma on staff, and also about how to work with staff who've experienced their own personal trauma, right? So making sure that we have resources to manage, let's say, organizational grief, for example. We need to make sure that we're thinking about the staff side of it also.
Great, thank you, Marissa. And Kate, can you talk a little bit about sort of the work that you're doing with Project Trust with regard to training?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to share a resource. So Sanad, in collaboration with USCRI and Brandeis University, is working with OVC as a training and technical assistance partner, specifically to focus on building out training and technical assistance for trauma-informed responses, programs, systems, and the entire spectrum of care. And there is really quite a large net in which providers, law enforcement entities, any individual stakeholder can reach out to Project Trust and request training and technical assistance for whatever area you might want to build out. So that is something definitely to take away from this webinar as a follow-up. That resource is there. Another report that just came out under Brandeis University and Project Trust is a study that was performed that looks at what is the state of trauma-informed care in the anti-trafficking space right now. So that report just came out, and we'd be really excited to share. It's also on the Project Trust website. So those are some great ways to start, and they can build in a lot of those things that Marissa just shared, is thinking about where do we have those gaps? We all have gaps as agencies. We can't do it all. Senar all the time is learning and growing, saying, all right, who can we partner with that really understands this, and bringing that in. So working on that collaborative approach and being able to celebrate when we don't have resources and that we have other entities and partners that can help bring those in is an exciting opportunity and time. And I think also coming with that spirit of we are all here in service of the work that we do to do that in the best way. And we do that through learning and constantly growing and evaluating.
Thank you, Kate. And clearly this is a wonderful resource. It's available to those on this call today. So thank you for sharing about that. I'd like to provide one more question coming from me from the panel, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience because we really want to hear from you and we want to have the opportunity to answer as many of your questions as possible. So if you haven't submitted one, but you have one on your mind, please feel free to type your question in the Q&A section, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. Panel, here is the question. And this also is building around training and training issues. So what is the best way to start making changes in an organization, and how can an organization train their staff in this approach? Marissa, let's start with you.
So I think there's no one way to approach becoming more trauma-informed. I'll offer you some components, maybe some steps that you might want to consider. So those may include things like something we've already discussed, which is requiring staff to participate in trauma-informed practice training, right? And not just once, but multiple times, you know, over the while they're working in the field. So training at onboarding and then on an ongoing basis. Also engaging in some sort of agency or programmatic self-assessment. And I would encourage you, as you're doing a self-assessment, to include multiple staff, because staff who are in different roles and have different experiences of how the program works are definitely going to have different perspectives about completing a self-assessment, and that would be really important to include. Engaging survivors and maybe current or former program participants in informing practices. Also reviewing, assessing, and changing existing policies and procedures as needed to improve programming. And this should really be fluid. It's not so much of, well, we've done all of this work and now we're there. We're fully trauma informed. As Kate said, it's not something of a, okay, we're there and we're done. It's an ongoing fluid process where even programs like ours who've been around for, you know, almost 13 years, we're always finding ways to do it better. We're learning new things. And when we learn new things and understand things better, we should make adjustments to make sure our program is working the best that it can. But I would encourage folks to start small, to focus and create a plan to expand and continue efforts over time. You know, make it feasible and tangible for you where you are in your work, and then implement practices and continue to assess and adjust those policies and procedures over time. And I'll just mention that for us at the Bikita Empowerment Initiative, we've taken several very specific steps to try to do this work better. And as Kate said, we can't do it alone. So we've relied on resources from other people. And I just want to mention that there are a lot of resources available through OVC and OVC TTAC. So I know early on, several years ago, we worked closely with OVC TTAC, and they helped develop some training that was very specific to needs that we had. And they collaborated with Project Reach to help with mental health specific training that was really important and impactful for our staff, specifically on resiliency and organizational grief. So please reach out to OVC TTAC, let them know what your needs are, and they will help get you connected to the resources that are really helpful. We also used the guiding principles for agencies serving survivors of human trafficking. We used that guide, it has a self-assessment in it. And we used that self-assessment to assess our own practices and make a plan for how to improve our work. And I'll say another really big thing that we did is we worked on developing an advisory board. So because we've had many program participants exit services over the years, we were able to go back to some of them and ask them if they would be willing and interested in engaging with our program again as peers and helping to inform our programming, improve our programming through the advisory board. And Christy Cho was a really big part of that effort for us. Christy came on site at least a couple times and helped provide us guidance on how to be really thoughtful and intentional to engage former program participants in an advisory board. And that is an ongoing tool for us to make sure our programming continues to improve and be more trauma informed.
Thank you, Marissa. And I love the different comments that you had on the different resources that are out there. I think, and certainly we heard about Kate's resources, and through this capacity building center here, there's also the opportunity to learn more about even other resources that are available. Christy, what are your thoughts on this question or these questions?
Yeah, there's, you guys have already said so, pretty much all of it, basically. But for me, you know, like what Marissa said, one of the ways to start small is, and this is not going to be glamorous, but it's to start at a policy level, you know, with your directors, with your managers, and to look at ways to really incorporate how staff and, well, think of trauma as not something only clients deal with, right? Think of trauma as something staff inevitably deals with at some point in their work in the organization, both personally and professionally. Let's recognize the heavy toll that this work takes on your staff, and let's take steps to support them. And that doesn't just include, you know, providing trainings, which is very critical, like Marissa said, but it's also to figure out internally what are the structures that are in place so that you're not scrambling to provide support when, you know, something happens or when somebody discloses something to you, but that it's normalized, like how Kate said, and that it's there, and that it's something that is encouraged for folks to reach out to and to grasp. And so I think that one of the resources that I created was a trauma-informed HR policy. It's a sample. It has not gone through any attorneys as far as I understand, but it's just a different way to apply a trauma-informed lens into something as rote as an HR policy. Everybody should have an HR policy, but when you add a trauma-informed lens to it, then shift it towards making sure and including the inevitability of trauma as something that your staff will deal with at some point, it really does create a stronger, more buffer resource for you guys. So.
Great. Thank you, Christy. And lastly, Kate, what are your thoughts on this and about how to create, you know, culture within an organization?
Well, I want to sort of marry the ideas of what Christy and Marissa have shared of starting small and tangible and policies, and thinking about for all of us that it's multi-layered. This isn't something that we can just do within direct service provision, or that we can just do within certain programs, or just do within client work, as Christy shared. This is what we live and breathe within organizations if we're integrating trauma lenses and we understand trauma-specific approaches. We also have to think about, as have been mentioned multiple times in this conversation, that we don't know our team's background. It is not a requirement to self-disclose our trauma histories. It should not be. And when we have positions that elevate survivor leaders in very empowering ways, or we have positions that integrate lived experiences, everyone within our team should be supported in the same way. We should prioritize wellness so that it's something that's not othering for individuals or doesn't require a focus on that survivor experience of whatever trauma that might be. And on the other side of that, recognizing vicarious and secondary trauma exposure as something that is very, very, very real. And it impacts everyone regardless of what part of the anti-trafficking space we are working in. And so we have to build those at every level. And that starts with modeling, right? It starts with modeling at different levels of the organization, practices that can be integrated, and thinking about every single aspect of how we deliver work has these lenses on them. It's not just sometimes. It is not optional to have it within certain conversations. It's within every task force meeting, within every conference that we go to, and within every client interaction. It is that full package, hard, deep work, but it really brings us back and centers us into the ground of what we all came here to do, which is to support every single person in building lives of their choosing. So I look at it as the heartbeat, but I also am from an organization that works specifically on trauma and its impact. So I'm a little bit biased, but I really can't say enough about thinking about ways we can support people, build in those tools, and build in those resources in meaningful ways. Just like Marissa shared, if we're teaching about grounding for our clients, we're also teaching our staff how to ground, right? And it's a parallel process. We're teaching that within everything that we do. So I think that goes all the way from the board level to every single frontline staff that we have working. We have to make sure that we fill in those gaps and it becomes a part of culture and how we operate as a field. And that's a really exciting concept for me, and I know for many people that I work with. So thank you very much, Susan. It's really an honor also to hear everything that Christy and Marissa bring, because it's such a substantive topic that has so many layers to it.
I agree. Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. Marissa, before we move into the audience questions, would you just take a few minutes to share your thoughts about how to put all this into practice, kind of the practical aspect of this?
I think that you just need to start somewhere. And I'd already mentioned a self-assessment, but a self-assessment is a really nice, tangible way. It's a good tool to use to know where to start. It will help provide some guidance. So I mentioned the guiding principle self-assessment, but I believe the Capacity Building Center is going to share a resource that has a list of different self-assessment tools on it. I would also say that OVC's model standards, now those are very in-depth, but they can also be a guide to you. They divide the model standards into program standards, competency standards, and ethical standards. And so you could go through any of those. And I know that for us, our experience was certain things just jumped out to us where we thought, we're not doing that well, or we have a big gap there. We need to focus on this area and this area and this area, because there were other areas where we thought, okay, well, we've made some good efforts there. And so while we'll keep working on them, we would initially prioritize focusing on some areas where we hadn't done very much work, if any, because we just didn't know. I mean, there's no way for us to know all of the things. We're all learning. And so I think we need to give ourselves some grace and some space to learn. But it can be a helpful tool to sort of write it down and make a plan. And so I really encourage using a self-assessment tool to get you started. And also making sure that you reach out to OVC and other resources to make sure that you have some guidance and get the information that you need.
Great, thank you, Marissa. What a great start to this conversation. And now we're going to move to taking questions from our audience. And we've already had some questions coming in. And I want to encourage others, if you have something that you're thinking about now, please send us your questions. And our first question, I am going to ask of Kate. Kate, this question has to do with creating expectations for clients, and what tips might you have on that, particularly around, again, we talk about being victim-centered. Well, what does that mean when we've got programs and we've got requirements maybe from a funder that we have to meet? Thinking about balancing all that, but ultimately, do you have some particular tips to help a client have better understanding of what expectations they may have?
Just to make sure I'm understanding, so is it sort of the idea of managing expectations for clients in a transparency area?
Yes, I think that's a beautiful summary of it, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was going in the right direction with that. It's such an important piece of transparency at the end of the day, right? And this comes back to the policies and procedures that we have in place when we think about how we complete and go through an assessment process and an intake process. Thinking about informed consent is our opportunity to set and manage expectations and be transparent about what we can and cannot offer. It's the place that we have the opportunity to talk about the limits to confidentiality, right? It's the place that we really have the empowerment place of that core that I talked about earlier, of thinking about ethics and empowerment and trauma consciousness and cultural relevancy. That's where we get to do that, is to make sure that we've built documentation and processes so that we are building in transparent conversations every single time we meet with an individual and client. And every organization is going to have different limitations. And so knowing that we want to look at the limitations of what we might have. For example, some of us may need to do a trafficking screening for eligibility at the beginning of service provision. Others, we may have a period of time, for example, within SINAD, where we have some time to look at what are those indicators because we're doing trauma-specific therapeutic services. So we talk about those differently within our agencies, but they're all grounded in looking at informed consent, which allows our clients then to say, I have a decision in this, right? Informed consent essentially means we look at what are the potential risks and what are the potential benefits, and we're honest about it. And that is one of those places I think we have tremendous opportunity, and how we deliver that is where the trauma consciousness comes in. The language we use, the tone we use, how we come into the room, how we're conscious of space. Do we have even sensory grounding objects as we're doing this? So there's sort of the two parts of that. There's the actual piece of managing the expectations, and then there's the delivery of that from a person-centered, humanistic place where it is one person sitting across from another, talking about what those limitations are and what those opportunities are.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. And Marissa, I'm curious, as also a provider of direct services, if you have, I mean, Kate just gave us a wonderful, wonderful response to that question, but I wondered if you had any additional tips that you would provide.
Well, I would say one tool that we use in that process that Kate described so well is we have a form that we've developed called a rights and responsibilities form. And it just clearly goes through what are someone's rights in services with us. And we start with rights because we feel like that's very empowerment based, but we also include responsibilities. So what are our expectations of you in the program also, so that it's very clear. And we want to make sure they go through that, ask us any questions that they have, so that we both have the best understanding of how this relationship will work in this way in the program. So it's really important to be transparent. It's really important to talk honestly about what your program can and can't do, and also to ensure that at the very beginning you're getting input in all aspects of the service provision from the folks who are engaging in services, because that's the only way that it will work and potentially be trauma informed, is to make sure that they're engaging and that you're responding to their needs and what they want.
Thank you very much. Our next question goes to Christy. Christy, you talked a little bit about staff experience with vicarious trauma or bringing their own trauma to work. And so I think the question is do you have any examples that you could provide on how one might address this successfully, and how might one manage it not so successfully?
So not a heavy lift at all whatsoever. Well, so I think that something that all organizations, or many organizations who work in this field do talk about thematically, is this combination of self-care, compassion, fatigue, and burnout. And I believe that vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, it sort of kind of falls into that area of, this is what's kind of widely accepted as like topics to talk about within an organization. When you have staff who are, and I feel like this is the best way that I've ever heard it described, when you feel like somebody is so burnt out that they're burnt toast, they're so crispy that like one more thing is going to just crumble them to bits and pieces. And, when you're able to see that as a coworker, as a manager, as a supervisor, or as, just even because clients can also see it too. we can't hide that from them. And so, when you see that, it's really about creating those conversations. Like I said, any aspect that can be applied to the program participants that you guys serve, it can be applied to your staff. You're talking about transparency. Let's talk about what I see. Let's talk about some of the things that I'm noticing, that I'm hearing from other clients, from coworkers, from supervisors, and do it and bring it up in a way that's actually grounded in skill sets. It's less about, let me talk about the multiple ways you're failing. It's not a great way to go about this topic, but talking about it in terms of, hey, I'm noticing this area, this phase of engagement where I feel like you're really struggling, because I see this, and this, and tell me what's going on here. Like, we really want you to execute this skill very well. Like, you've highlighted it in your annual evaluation for yourself. Like, you really want to, hit this, but, I'm really seeing you struggle and I'm wondering what's going on. And so being able to bring that up in a way, and hopefully it's not the first time that, you're creating this conversation, and doing it in a way. And again, Marissa mentioned training for supervisors. This is one of those things where I would definitely hope that being able to talk about trauma, personal trauma, in a way that's not exploitive, that in a way that's not, what's the official word, like icky? that's professional and has boundaries. Your role, they know theirs, and being able to discuss in a professional setting about the impact of personal trauma on your professional life. And so what that looks like should be thoughtfully and intentionally actually written out for directors and for supervisors.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Susan, if I could just add to that.
Yes.
I think also in regard, this is a shared responsibility. So this is a responsibility of staff themselves and also of supervisors and agency leadership to make sure we're all addressing this. And one tool that we have used that seems to have been really helpful for us is talking about self-awareness. So learning about why do we feel the ways that we feel at certain times, but talking about it in very general ways so that it doesn't hone in necessarily on specific traumas, but so that it's more general and helps us to get a better sense for how we function as human beings, because all of us function differently. And what we do is we talk about it with staff. So we started this by having a facilitated training in a staff retreat to talk about self-awareness, and that's what we focused on. And we specifically used the tool of the Enneagram, but there are lots of tools that you can use for self-awareness. That is only one. And that has seemed to be a helpful tool for our staff. And it also teaches how to better communicate with one another and how to better understand one another. And so it has actually been a tremendous tool for me as a supervisor to better understand my staff. I feel like they're giving me an inside look, right? And I'm giving them an inside look into me. And it really helps us manage all of these very difficult challenges in our work. I mean, this is hard work that we're doing, and trauma is hard and complicated, but there are ways to navigate it. And I have found that self-awareness for staff is key.
Just one more quick thing. I do apologize for taking a long time on this question, but Marissa, you just reminded me that, we talk about when we work with victims of trafficking and survivors, we have sometimes a very specific picture depending on the types of folks that we serve, but also broadly speaking, right now, there's a lot of traumatic things happening in our world. Whether the issues are related to social and racial injustice, whether it's climate change, whether it's, immigration and legal reform, there's a lot that people can get really just connected to. And one of the phrases that I don't hear very often, and I think it's because everyone accepts it and understands it to be, yes, this is how we should do it, but people struggle to actually do the work, is to approach things with cultural humility. A lot of the folks that we serve, a lot of direct service providers, as opposed to leadership and board members and management staff, there is disparity. There's a lot of, it's like a lot of white women at the top, and a lot of people of color on the bottom doing direct work. A lot of the folks that we serve, especially in the urban areas, are going to be people of color. And so when we talk about trauma and we talk about what it means to serve somebody, and when you are the only person of color in an organization that serves people of color, but your entire rest of your staff are not people of color, you're dragging that around with you. I don't have better words for that. You are dragging that with you. And especially right now, if you're tapped into anything that's happening in our news or our society, you're bringing that with you too. And so being able to address it with cultural humility, you don't need to be a person of color to be able to work with and be trauma informed with other people of color. But being able to say that I will never understand your culture, but I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, I'm here to help and serve you, couldn't go so far. So I just had to insert that just a little bit right there.
Well, and I want to ask a follow-up question, and I have a feeling any one of you might have some thoughts on this, and we could kind of keep it a little bit on the brief side, and again, we can expand more for the audience through our FAQs, but I'm curious, kind of recognizing that everyone has a role to play in supporting the implementation of a trauma-informed organization, but how specifically, do you have any couple, one or two tips that you can offer for how we can hold staff and upper management accountable for these practices and accountable for really ensuring that the environment is a safe, trauma-informed environment? Your thoughts in a couple of seconds.
Susan, was there anyone you wanted to start? I wasn't.
Actually, I'll start with you, Kate. I think
Okay.
the census, maybe any of you have thoughts on this, but yes, let's start with you.
I want to just sort of wrap around and I'll take from where Christy left off and bring it into that. And I think part of that is recognizing privilege and owning privilege and having conversations and being comfortable to talk about our privilege and think about those moments, whether that is the privilege that we have in administrative roles, whether that is the privilege that we have right now from the places that we sit and stand in society. And when we think about that, we have to look at representation within our organizations. There's internal accountability, but there are also ways that we have to look at and assess our organization from external evaluation. And we have to be willing to step back and have that process. It is not always an easy process. It is a difficult process that takes accountability, it takes humility, it takes accountability, and it requires us to shift dialogue and space to other places. When we have been accustomed to monopolizing certain positions in society, when we have been accustomed to having different places where we are allowed to have our voices heard and others are not, it is our responsibility essentially to step back and create that space. So I think that the concrete ways to do that are, one, exactly what Marissa talked about, self-awareness. We can't do this without self-awareness, right? And if we're really sitting there with the blinders on, that's not going to happen. So we have that self-awareness piece for leadership, for boards, for organizations. And the other part of that is looking at the world around us and asking meaningful questions when we look at our organizations and we look at leadership and we see that there are problems. We have to then step back, address, and support it. And so I think that's where I really look at accountability comes from policies and procedures very often, right? Accountability comes from cultural structures within organizations that hold us accountable. When we're in positions of power and we don't build systems of accountability, that is a way for us to get around those conversations. So it's kind of a two-part, not this is the formula to how we get there, but there are real ways to have meaningful conversations, but we have to be willing to start them, sit with them, and listen. So I think that's my biggest takeaway is how do we listen and give space to other individuals so that we can make changes.
Great, thank you. I want to move to another question. I know that there's so much to talk on this topic, but I want to get in as many questions as possible. So this is a real shift in focus, and I think I'm going to open it up to the panel for anyone who might have a response to it. And this has to do with pet therapy teams and working with pets in the, and I guess the question is, to what your extent are you familiar with pet therapy teams working with survivors? And in your experience, has it been helpful? Has it worked? And do you know about, are there any model programs around this?
Okay, so I'm the last person that you guys probably expected to know about animal-assisted therapy, but I do know of a couple of programs. I cannot remember their names. It's actually been a while since I've done direct practice, but I do know that equine therapy and trauma have been connected in research. But I also want to remind folks that the integral component of animal-assisted therapy is also for folks who don't jive with four-wall therapy. These are just they're complementary modalities. So whether it's body movement, whether it's narrative therapy, whether it's something that is completely outside of what you would normally consider clinical therapy, animal-assisted therapy, AAT, is also something for I do believe, and Kate, I don't know if you know this, or if you can talk to this, but I believe that there is a lot around AAT in minors, for children, young people who have just difficulty putting words to things. And because, and equine therapy in particular, because of their incredible empathy and their ability to reflect and be responsive to the person who is actually grooming them, which is actually, it's not riding the horse, it's actually interacting in a caring way with the horse that provides the therapeutic component. And so that's what I have for you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you.
We use animal-assisted therapy quite a bit in our programs and direct services. So one, Christy, I love equine therapy. If that's all we could offer, we unfortunately are not necessarily located in an area where it's super accessible. but we have therapy dogs that come into our office. I actually have one of my companions is a therapy dog. So she will sit in on groups. She will go with individuals if they have to go and do a TRU visa affidavit. It changes the game to have the sensory-based individual there that you can connect with without having to verbalize. They will sit in on individual sessions, and I can't speak enough to how much having animals in our office has changed the way that people can come in and feel safe. And that may mean that the relationship that they're building safety with in the beginning is a 3-pound Chiweenie. Who is there and who is providing immense love and has warmth and has the ability to look at them and communicate, and they can communicate as well. So I can definitely send out some additional resources on ways to build that into your program. But we have found, particularly in our clinical evaluations, the integration of animal-assisted therapy has significant impacts on outcomes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Christy. The next question that I want to ask, I think this recognizes that being a trauma-informed service or trauma-informed organization is not exclusive to victim service providers. Certainly, I think every organization that comes in contact or agencies have, I believe, real responsibility to shift towards trauma-informed care. So this question, I want to pitch to Marissa and to Kate, both as victim service providers, working directly with survivors. If you have any thoughts on what you would like to see integrated into the legal realm, whether it's into the courts and into policy, again, it kind of goes beyond victim services, but your thoughts on maybe where some gaps are, or if you have any idea in terms of, again, what you might like to see out there become more integrated when it comes to the legal system, perhaps the civil legal system, and even the criminal justice system.
Well, I'll start with something very specific because I think this can be a really broad question. I think that generally in our legal systems, we really need to move away from making cases so dependent on a victim's testimony, and that is the only evidence that we have. We need to do a better job of gathering other evidence in other ways. And that requires a perspective change in how we approach the work. It really can have a tremendous impact on those who have had, in particular in this case, experiences of trafficking. It can so impact someone's functioning to know that I'm going to be required to participate in this process in order for something to happen legally. And for some folks, that's the only remedy that they feel like is available to them is something in a court. And so right now we're very dependent on survivors of crime to make these cases possible. And I think that can do a lot of harm. It can really impact the level of trauma for substantial periods of time. I mean, these cases can last 2, 3, 4 years, where you're so focused on the fact that if you want someone to be convicted, you're going to have to show up in court and face them. That it can be difficult to continue to meet other goals in your life that you have, because you're spending so much time having to focus on just getting through court. So I know that's very specific, but I think that in the type of work that we're talking about specifically, that is a really important component that we need a huge change in our perspective and how we go about this, because it has such a huge impact. Thank you, Marissa.
And I can just very briefly, because I could do an entire hour on this piece, is just training, right? Law enforcement have mandatory training programs. Attorneys go through mandatory training programs and CLEs. We should all understand the neurobiological impact of memory. And so that is exactly to the point of Marissa, when we are asking individuals to recall events that are in order and in sequence, and our brain fundamentally does not encode traumatic memory that way, we are missing something very important about how we investigate crime and how we rely on those pieces. And so if we had a baseline understanding collectively as to why individuals may not be able to recall traumatic events in that way. And we ask questions in a different way, and we use systems that validated sensory-based memories and other pieces, we would have fundamentally different outcomes and a different understanding and a different way that we investigate. So if we could integrate some of those trainings in the same way that we do for mandatory trainings of other parts of investigations or legal services, I can imagine that there would be a very different outcome for individuals impacted by interpersonal violence and crime.
Thank you, Kate. We only have time for one more question, and we're going to have to wrap up pretty quickly. But Kate, I wanted to direct this last question to you. And this has to do with working with interpreters and what suggestions you may have of, again, kind of best practices when there may be an interpreter involved, and how do you ensure that the again, the services that are provided really are provided through that trauma lens?
So it's a really great question and a really big question. So I think one of those pieces is, who are your interpreters? So thinking about where and how do we source interpretation? Do we have training for interpreters and translators to understand different kinds of language? What kind of confidentiality agreements are there within that to protect individuals? And also thinking about different communities where there are very small linguistic communities that maybe interpretation could also have very real impacts of that information getting out within those communities. So I don't think I can do justice to the question in just a couple of minutes, but there are always those principles of going back to when we provide information and knowledge to individuals, including interpreters, prior to rendering services. That's how we are able to provide supportive measures and make sure that even the way that things are interpreted have that baseline lens of what it means to speak to someone in a person-centered, kind, humanistic, and respectful way through that process.
Thank you, Kate. And on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. And again, wonderful questions. We have many more questions we couldn't get to, and we are going to be providing responses to those questions after this through a frequently asked questions document. So keep looking out for that. I want to thank the panelists, Kate, Marissa, Christy, for being here today and for all of your thoughtful feedback. And I want to thank the participants for all the wonderful questions that you have provided us. This has really been a powerful conversation, and I really hope that it sparks and continues to spark conversations in your communities, and in terms of how to really provide victim-centered and trauma-informed care and services. I want to encourage everybody who participated today to contact the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center for free coaching and mentoring, and to help with your anti-trafficking efforts. There's tremendous resources there, and they're ready to help and support. And then I think, just kind of in closing, I just want to say that with all of us doing our part, I believe that we can really help ensure that victims of human trafficking are being recognized in their community and are getting connected to the resources that they need. So again, thank you for all of the work that everybody's doing on behalf of survivors, and we'll continue to work forward together. Thank you.
Well, Susan, I want to thank you for moderating today's session. As Susan mentioned, we'll be following up with each of you through email, attaching relevant resources that we've been dropping throughout the chat during this session. You'll also find an FAQ document with the questions and answer. And we'll also be sharing information on the next Ask an Expert session. We hope you found today's session informative, and we look forward to having you join a future Ask an Expert session. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.